He was holding his mother when she died. No one came. No one helped. Just a young Jedi, alone in a Tuscan tent on a desert planet at the edge of the galaxy, cradling the woman who had been his entire world for as long as he had been alive. She opened her eyes. She touched his face. She said his name. And then she was gone. What happened next? In the minutes and hours that followed, set in motion every catastrophe that came after. The war, the fall, the empire. All of it traces back to this tent. This moment, this single wound that never closed. But here is what nobody tells you. That night on Tatooine was not the beginning of the breaking. It was the end of a process that had been running for years, quietly, beneath the surface. In the place where Anakin Skywalker kept everything the galaxy was not allowed to see. This is the story of how the greatest Jedi of his generation became the most feared enforcer of a galactic empire. Not the version with lightsabers and prophecies and battles across the stars. The real version. The one that starts before any of that. The one that starts with a boy who had nothing in the universe except one person, and who was then taken away from her, and who spent the rest of his life trying to find a power large enough to make sure nothing he loved could ever be taken again. He never found it. What he found instead destroyed everything. You have to start on Tatooine. Tatooine is the kind of place the galaxy forgets on purpose. It sits in the outer rim, far enough from Coruscant that Republic lore exists mostly as a rumor, and far enough from civilization that the beings who end up there usually had no other choice. 2 suns beat down on its surface every single day, and the planet answers by offering almost nothing in return. No water worth speaking of. No trees. No shade that lasts long enough to matter. The ground is pale and ancient and indifferent. And the wind that moves across it carries sand fine enough to find its way into everything. People who grow up there develop a particular relationship with hardship. Not the kind of hardship that builds character in the comfortable sense. The kind that motivates someone to push through a difficult week or a challenging project. The hardship of Tatooine is structural. It is baked into every transaction, every interaction, every breath of dry air. Survival there is not a triumph. It is simply what happens when you have not yet died. And underneath even Tatooine's brutal hierarchy, beneath the moisture farmers scraping livings from the soil and the merchants hustling through the canyon markets of Mos Eisley, beneath the gamblers and the bounty hunters and the beings who had come to the edge of the galaxy specifically to disappear, there was another class, entirely. The ones who did not have the luxury of struggling for themselves. The ones who belonged to someone else. The slaves. Anakin Skywalker was born into that lowest class. He never knew his father. His mother, Shmi, would tell him years later that there was no father, that he had simply arrived. That she had carried him and brought him into the world without any man's involvement in the making of him. At the time, this fact existed quietly in the background of their lives without demanding explanation. There were more immediate things to think about, like surviving the day, like pleasing whoever happened to own them that season, like finding small moments of peace in a life that was not theirs to control. What does it do to a child to grow up knowing they are property? Think about that carefully. Not metaphorically property, not in the sense of feeling controlled or restricted the way children sometimes describe their parents' rules. Actually, legally, commercially, irreversibly property, bought and sold like a part for a machine. A child who grows up in that reality develops a relationship with the concept of self that is unlike anything experienced by those who grew up free. The self becomes a fragile and private thing, something that exists only in the interior, in the thoughts no one can access, in the dreams that happen behind closed eyes. On the outside, you belong to someone else. On the inside is the only space that is truly yours. Anakin understood this from an age so young he could not have articulated it. He simply lived it. He did what he was told because the alternative was pain or punishment or something worse happening to his mother. He worked, he built, he repaired, he maintained a smile that functioned like armor, a performance of compliance that kept the dangerous realities of his situation at bay. But inside, in that private space that no owner could reach, something else was happening. Something was building. Something that had no name yet and no direction, but that pushed against the walls of its container with a constant low pressure that never let him rest. That pressure was the Force. Anakin Skywalker's connection to the Force was not simply strong, it was unprecedented. When the Jedi Council eventually measured the concentration of midi-chlorians in his blood, the number they found was higher than anything in their recorded history, higher than Master Yoda, higher than any Jedi who had ever lived. The Force was not just present in him the way it was present in most Force sensitives, as a gift, as a potential, as a quiet hum beneath the surface of normal life. In Anakin, it was something closer to a constant state of being. Everything he touched had texture beyond its physical properties. Every person he met carried an emotional weight he could sense without trying. The world around him was richer and more complex and more alive than the world other people perceived. And he had no framework for understanding why. He did not know he was Force sensitive. He just knew he was different. He knew he could feel things coming before they happened, that his hands moved faster than his eyes should have been able to direct them, that machines made sense to him in a way they did not seem to make sense to anyone else around him. He could feel the shape of a piece of technology and understand instinctively what it wanted to do, what was wrong with it, what it needed. He built things from scrap that engineers with formal training and proper tools would have struggled to assemble. He did this because it was the one area of his life where he had genuine mastery. A slave child has very few sources of dignity. Anakin found his in the act of creation, in the moment when something broken or incomplete became whole and functional under his hands. Among the things he built, nothing mattered more to him than his protocol droid. He constructed C-3PO from spare parts, gathered piece by piece over many months, building the droid slowly and carefully in the back of the place where they slept, assembling a companion out of salvage and patience. He built it partly out of the logic of usefulness, partly to have something to work on, and partly, though he might not have admitted this even to himself, because he was lonely in a way that a child his age should never have to be lonely. He wanted something that would stay, something that would not be sold away, something he had made and that therefore felt, in some small but significant way, like his own. His mother, Shmi, was the whole world to him. That is not a metaphor. That is not the kind of exaggerated emotional language that adults use to describe childhood attachment in retrospect. For Anakin Skywalker, Shmi was literally the entire structure of his emotional reality. Everything that made his life survivable ran through her. Her voice was the sound that told him at the end of each difficult day that something in this universe was still good. Her face was the thing he looked for in any room he entered. Her presence was the only unconditional safety he had ever known. She did not have power. She did not have freedom. She did not have money or influence or any of the tools with which parents typically protect their children from the worst of the world. What she had was herself, and she gave it entirely to him. Shmi Skywalker was a remarkable woman in ways that are easy to miss because she is not a Jedi or a politician or a warrior. She was a slave who managed, against all odds and within the narrowest possible circumstances, to raise a child who knew he was loved. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, an almost impossible thing given the conditions she was working within. She could not promise Anakin safety. She could not promise him a future. She could not even promise him that they would still be together from one year to the next, because they were owned. And ownership meant that everything about their lives could change at someone else's whim. What she could do was make him feel every single day that he mattered, that he was worth something beyond his market value, that the universe had put him here for a reason, and that reason was meaningful and real. She talked to him about his future in terms that were aspirational despite having no realistic foundation for aspiration. She encouraged him when he built things. She listened when he talked. She stayed awake at night when he was sick and held whatever form of comfort she could offer against the helplessness of their situation. She could not fix his life. She fixed it anyway, at least in the only dimension where it was possible to fix it, in the private interior world, where a child's sense of self is formed, and where the damage done by circumstances either breaks or fails to fully break what lies underneath. Anakin loved her with the totality that only young children can manage, and that most people slowly lose as they grow older and learn to distribute their emotional investment more cautiously across a wider range of relationships. He had not learned caution yet. He had not learned to protect himself by loving less. She was everything to him, and he gave her everything he had. And that was not a flaw in his character at that age. It was simply the truth of who he was, a child who had very little but who loved without reservation the one person who loved him back. This would become the wound that everything else grew from. But that wound had not yet fully opened. In those early years on Tatooine, it existed only as a potential, as the structural vulnerability that would later prove catastrophic. For now, there was daily life. There was work. There was the particular texture of existence in Mos Espa, the slave quarters where they lived, the shop where Watto, their Toydarian owner, kept his inventory of spaceship parts and miscellaneous junk. Watto was not the cruelest master Anakin could have had. He was not gentle or kind or interested in Anakin's inner life in any meaningful way, but he was not systematically sadistic. He was primarily interested in profit, and Anakin's mechanical genius made him valuable. And value, in that context, bought a certain kind of protection, not dignity, not freedom, not anything that would show up on any list of things a child deserves, but a working arrangement that allowed Anakin some degree of latitude in how he spent the hours he was not actively being used. In those hours, Anakin did what children do. He played, in his fashion. He had a small circle of friends in the slave quarters, other children with their own private wounds, their own performances of normalcy over their own impossible foundations. He raced pods in his mind, long before he ever got behind the controls of one, studying the machines with the same instinctive understanding he brought to everything mechanical, learning their tendencies, their weaknesses, their rhythms. Pod racing was the great passion of Tatooine, the event that drew crowds from across the Outer Rim and generated the kind of money that could change lives, or in the right circumstances, buy them. Anakin knew this. He had calculated it in the careful, quiet way that slave children learn to calculate everything that might someday offer a way out. He was 9 years old when Qui-Gon Jinn walked into Watto's shop. There are moments in a life that function as dividing lines. Before this moment, after this moment, Anakin had not had many of them yet. 9 being too young for most of the events that reconfigure a person's internal landscape. But this was one, though he could not have known it at the time. He did not know what a Jedi was in any deep sense. He knew the general outline, the warriors of the Republic, the keepers of peace, the wielders of lightsabers. He had heard of them the way children in remote corners of the galaxy heard of anything beyond their immediate horizon, as stories, as distant and slightly abstract figures from a world too far away to feel real. Qui-Gon Jinn did not look like a story. He was tall and solid and unhurried, in the way of someone who had long ago made peace with the pace at which things needed to happen. He moved through the shop with a kind of calm that was different from the enforced patience Anakin had observed in most adults around him. Their patience was usually suppression, the deliberate management of frustration or fear or anger held in check by circumstances. Qui-Gon's calm was something else. It was structural. It came from a place so deep in him that it did not seem to require maintenance. He was accompanied by a girl, a young woman really, regal, even in the plain clothes of a handmaiden, and a small Gungan being whose relationship with coordination was ongoing and uncertain. Anakin felt something when he looked at the Jedi Master, something he had felt in the Force his entire life without having a name for it, a recognition, a resonance. He did not understand what it was. He understood that it mattered. The conversation that followed changed everything about the next chapter of Anakin's life, though in the beginning it was mostly just a conversation. Qui-Gon was stranded on Tatooine with a damaged ship, a queen in hiding, and no money that worked on a planet where Republic credits were largely meaningless. He needed parts. Anakin, recognizing something, invited the strangers home. His mother, displaying the kind of hospitality that can only be truly understood as an act of grace from people who have very little to offer, welcomed them. That night, around the modest table in their modest quarters, Qui-Gon Jinn looked at Anakin Skywalker the way no one had ever looked at him before. Not as a piece of equipment, not as a promising investment or a useful resource. He looked at him with the quiet attention of someone who had just recognized something significant and was being careful about what to do with that recognition. He spoke to Anakin about the Force. He asked him questions. He tested the speed of his reflexes with a small device. And in the measured but undisguised way of a man who trusted what he was experiencing, he began to believe what his instincts were already telling him. This child was special in a way that defied even Jedi experience. He took a sample of Anakin's blood that night, quietly, without alarm, and sent it to Obi-Wan Kenobi to have the midi-chlorian count measured. The result came back while the sandstorm howled outside and the strangers sheltered in the slave quarters. The number was impossible. It was higher than anything in the archives. Qui-Gon sat with that information and what it implied. And he did not panic, and he did not immediately act. But something in him settled into a certainty that would define everything that followed. He believed, in the way Qui-Gon Jinn believed things, which was with a depth and a stubbornness that his own order sometimes found inconvenient, that this boy was the one, the chosen one, the being prophesied, to bring balance to the Force. The figure the ancient texts spoke of in terms carefully ambiguous enough that generations of Jedi scholars could debate the exact meaning, but clear enough that the general outline was understood. Someone would come who was strong beyond measuring. Someone would come who would change everything. Qui-Gon looked at the 9-year-old boy building droids from scrap in the back room of a Tatooine junk shop and believed, completely and without reservation, that this was that person. He also needed him to help win a pod race. In the short term, the situation was practical before it was prophetic. Watto had the parts they needed. Watto's parts could be won in a bet on the pod race that was coming to Mos Espa. Anakin was, against all established wisdom about what species were even capable of handling the physiological demands of pod racing, the only human who could fly a pod. His reflexes were too fast for human explanation because they were not operating by human means. They were operating through the Force, through that constant ambient awareness of his surroundings that he had lived with his entire life, without knowing what to call it. He was not just a talented child. He was a child through whom the Force moved so naturally and completely that the distinction between his own perception and the Force's guidance had never been clear to him, because for him there was no meaningful distinction. He simply felt the world more fully than other people did and responded to what he felt. The night before the race, Qui-Gon sat with Anakin and told him something. He told him he was a Jedi. He told him he believed in him. He told him in the measured and careful way of a teacher who understood the weight of what he was offering, that he thought Anakin had the potential to become something extraordinary. For a 9-year-old boy whose entire life had consisted of being told what he was worth in commercial rather than personal terms, this was not a small thing to hear. It was enormous. It was almost too large to process. He went to sleep that night carrying it. This idea that someone believed in him in a way that went beyond his usefulness. And whatever that belief activated in him, whatever it awakened and organized and directed, it carried him through the next day. The Boonta Eve Classic is chaos by design. Pod racing is one of the most dangerous sports in the galaxy, and the Boonta Eve race is one of the most dangerous iterations of it, run through canyon passages, where the walls are close enough to shear through a pod at full speed, and where the other races operate under essentially no rules beyond the one rule that matters, which is finishing first. Anakin had prepared for this race for as long as he had been conscious of it as something real and not just a fantasy, and he had poured everything he knew about engines and speed and the particular personalities of the various races into his preparation. He had built the pod himself from parts he had collected and assembled with the same care he brought to everything mechanical. When the starting line counted down and the pods lurched forward and the noise of the race swallowed everything else, Anakin Skywalker flew. He flew the way only he could fly, with that particular quality of awareness that came from the Force moving through him as naturally as breath, reading the track before he reached it, sensing the movements of other pilots with enough lead time to respond, navigating obstacles not through calculation, but through something closer to intuition that was too precise and too reliable to be mere instinct. He survived the parts of the race that should not have been survivable. He overcame mechanical failure through sheer reactive genius. He endured Sebulba's deliberate sabotage attempts and emerged from the chaos of the race's final stages with enough lead to cross the finish line first. He won. He earned his freedom. The moment after the race, when the reality of what had just happened began to settle into Anakin's understanding, had the quality of something too large for immediate emotion. Freedom was a concept he had grown up with as an absence, as a word for what other people had. Now it was his. It was actually, technically, legally his. He looked at Qui-Gon, and he felt the full force of what was being offered to him. The freedom, the training, the future, the becoming of something that until the day before had been entirely outside the category of things that could be expected to happen to a 9-year-old slave boy on Tatooine. And then came the moment that broke the first piece of something in him. He could not take his mother. Qui-Gon had tried. He had pushed Watto further than Watto was willing to go. He had offered what he had and maneuvered as far as the situation allowed. And it was not enough. Watto would release the boy, but not the woman. In the cold arithmetic of slave ownership, Shmi's value was separate from Anakin's value. And the deal that freed one did not extend to the other. She would remain behind. She would remain in the shop, on the planet, at the edge of the galaxy, while Anakin was taken to the center of everything. Think about what that moment required of her. Shmi Skywalker stood before her son and told him to go. She did not collapse. She did not beg Qui-Gon to find another way, though perhaps she wanted to. She did not make it harder for him by making her own pain the loudest thing in the room. She told him that she had given birth to him for a reason, and she believed this reason was standing in front of them. This Jedi Master from the wider galaxy who had looked at her son and seen not a slave, but a destiny. She released him. She let him go. She stood there in the desert and watched the ship rise and carry him away from her, and she stayed standing. And the strength that required is something that people who have never been powerless in that particular way tend to significantly underestimate. And Anakin let himself be led away because she told him to, and because Qui-Gon was there, and because the chance being offered to him was real and enormous and represented everything he had ever imagined and more. He let himself be led away, and he looked back, and he saw her getting smaller, and something inside him that would never fully close again opened in that moment. He was 9 years old. He had just won his freedom in a race that could have killed him. He was about to go to Coruscant and train as a Jedi. He was leaving his mother behind, in chains. The contradictions of that reality did not resolve themselves into something manageable over the following hours. They settled into him instead, finding the space between the joy and the grief and occupying it permanently. He had learned something on that dusty landing strip outside Mos Espa, something that the years ahead would only deepen and reinforce. The universe had a way of giving you what you wanted with one hand and taking something essential with the other. The great gift came at a cost that had not been explained in advance, and the cost was the one thing you had not been prepared to pay. Coruscant was everything Tatooine was not. It was dense and vertical and alive, with the constant movement of millions of beings going about their lives in the layered architecture of the galaxy's capital. From orbit, it looked like a jewel, all glittering lights and organized geometry, the physical expression of a civilization so old and so powerful that it had covered an entire planet with itself. On the ground, in the wide corridors of the Jedi Temple, it was something more complicated, something that Anakin felt the grandeur of, while simultaneously failing to feel entirely at home inside of. The Jedi Temple was old in the way of institutions that have outlived their founders by thousands of years and carry that history in their walls. It was orderly. It was quiet in the particular way of places where people have collectively agreed to manage their emotional expression. It was full of Jedi who moved through their days with a serenity that Anakin could observe but not yet access, a serenity that came from training begun in infancy and sustained across decades of practice and philosophy. He was 9 years old, and he had come from a desert planet where he had been owned by a flying alien businessman, and his relationship with emotional serenity was essentially non-existent. He was alive with feeling all the time. The loss of his mother, the excitement of this new world, the wonder of seeing the Force acknowledged and practiced openly rather than just sensed privately, the fear of not belonging, the hope of becoming something, the grief still sitting in the corner of everything, all of it at once. Constantly, he stood before the Jedi High Council, and the Jedi High Council looked at him. This is one of the most important moments of Anakin Skywalker's life, and it is easy to underestimate it because its significance is not dramatic in any visible way. No one raised their voice. No one was unkind in any overt sense. The council was composed of 12 of the most powerful and wise Jedi in the Order, beings who had spent lifetimes understanding the Force and reading the hearts of those who stood before them. They asked him questions, they tested him, they read him, and then they told him no. Yoda was the one who articulated it most clearly, as Yoda tended to be the one who articulated things, not because his words were always gentle, but because his understanding was always precise. What he said to Anakin Skywalker was this: he sensed much fear in him, fear of losing his mother, fear of the future, fear of failing, and fear, in the Jedi understanding of the Force and its dangers, was the beginning of a path that led to places no one wanted to go. Fear led to anger. Anger led to hatred. Hatred led to suffering. It was a chain of causation the Jedi had observed across centuries of watching Force-sensitive beings, and Yoda had watched more centuries of it than anyone else in the room. His reading of Anakin was not wrong. The fear was real. It was enormous. It was baked into the structure of who Anakin was by 9 years of living in a reality over which he had no control and where the things he loved most were perpetually in danger. What the Council decided, based on this reading, was that Anakin Skywalker was too old to begin training and too full of fear to begin safely. They did not say this to be cruel. They said it because they believed it, and they were not entirely wrong, but they were not entirely right either. And the way they were wrong would cost more than any of them could calculate at that moment. What they failed to account for was what they were refusing alongside the risk. They were refusing a child who had been through something they had never experienced and could not fully imagine. They were refusing a boy who had grown up as property, who had survived that by building in himself a fierce and tenacious sense of his own value, who had been loved unconditionally by a mother who gave him everything she had in impossible circumstances, who had just won his own freedom in the most dramatic possible way, and who was standing in front of them full of fear, not because he was weak, but because he had genuine things to fear, and had been carrying them alone for years without the tools the temple was built to provide. They were reading his fear as a disqualifying flaw when a different reading might have recognized it as the correct emotional response to a life that had genuinely been frightening. They told Qui-Gon no, and Qui-Gon told them he would train the boy anyway. This was characteristically Qui-Gon. He was a Jedi Master who had spent his career existing in productive tension with the Council's orthodoxy. Not because he was rebellious in any selfish sense, but because his understanding of the living Force, of the way the Force moved in the immediate present, rather than in theories and codes and accumulated doctrine, was different enough from the prevailing institutional wisdom to put him sideways with the Order on a fairly regular basis. He loved the Jedi. He honored the Force. He simply did not believe that the Council's version of either was the final or complete one. He had followed the Force to Tatooine. The Force had led him to this boy. He was not going to turn away from what the Force had put in front of him because 12 masters in a semicircle had misread the moment. So Anakin was in a state of suspension when they arrived on Naboo. Technically not accepted into the Order. Technically not Qui-Gon's Padawan. Existing in the space between what he had been offered and what had been formally confirmed, which was a familiar enough kind of uncertainty for a boy who had spent his whole life in situations he did not fully control. He had Qui-Gon's belief in him. He had the promise of a future that was still forming. And he had Padme. Padme Amidala was not introduced to him as the Queen of Naboo. She was introduced to him as a handmaiden, as part of the Queen's retinue, and what Anakin felt when he saw her was the uncomplicated intensity of a 9-year-old encountering someone who appeared to him as remarkable. She was kind to him in a way that felt genuine and not performed. She was warm in an environment where he was mostly encountering assessment and evaluation. He asked her, with the artless directness of a child, if she was an angel. He had heard of angels, beings of great beauty and goodness, and she seemed to him to be one. It was not a sophisticated observation. It was simply what he saw when he looked at her. He could not have known, at 9, what that moment of recognition would eventually become or what it would cost either of them. On Naboo, things moved too fast for the weight of what was happening to be fully felt until afterward. The Trade Federation blockade had become an invasion. The planet was under occupation. Queen Amidala was moving to reclaim it, with whatever alliance she could forge, and whatever force she could muster. Anakin ended up in the cockpit of a Naboo starfighter, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the battle unfolded the way battles do, in directions that nobody fully controls, and Anakin ended up in the one place he always ended up, in high-stakes chaos. The pilot's seat of a machine that needed someone with his particular relationship with the Force to keep it together. He won that fight too. He won it by accident and by instinct and by the Force moving through him in the way it always had, guiding his hands before his mind could form a complete thought about what to do. He flew into the belly of the droid control ship and fired torpedoes, and the battle ended. But Qui-Gon Jinn died. He died on a reactor shaft in the Theed Palace generator complex, run through by a Sith warrior named Darth Maul, who was faster than anyone they had encountered and who fought with a ferocity that no one in the temple had quite anticipated. Obi-Wan Kenobi was separated from his master by an energy field and watched through the barrier, helpless, as Qui-Gon fell. Qui-Gon died on the floor of the facility while Obi-Wan screamed from behind the field and later threw himself at Maul with everything he had and somehow prevailed, bisecting the Sith warrior and sending him into the shaft, driven by grief and desperation and something the Force gave him when he needed it most. And Anakin, who had spent more time with Qui-Gon than he had spent with almost any adult male figure in his life, who had been chosen by this man with a conviction that felt different from anything he had previously experienced, who had believed in Qui-Gon's belief in him in the way that children believe in the adults who have decided they are worth believing in, lost him. He was 9 years old. He had lost his mother to a desert planet weeks ago. He had just lost the man who had seen him and chosen him and promised him a future. The grief of Qui-Gon's death settled into the same place as the grief of leaving Tatooine, into that space below the surface, where things too large to process fully go to wait. He was not given time to grieve properly. There was no structure in place for that, no extended period of mourning, no careful attention to what a child just orphaned of his mentor might need in order to integrate a loss of that magnitude. The battle had been won. There was a celebration. There was a funeral pyre. And there was Obi-Wan Kenobi, who stood at the pyre and looked at Anakin and told him what Qui-Gon had asked him to promise. He would be Anakin's master. He would train him. The Council, perhaps moved by the events on Naboo, perhaps moved by Obi-Wan's own raw grief and the weight of the promise he had made to his dying mentor, perhaps recognizing that the moment had passed where refusal made sense, agreed. Anakin Skywalker would be trained. He would become a Jedi. Obi-Wan Kenobi would be his master. Obi-Wan was 25 years old. He had just lost his master. He was about to become one. The early years of Anakin's training are difficult to understand without understanding the nature of the relationship that formed between him and Obi-Wan. It was not a simple relationship. It was not a comfortable one, though it would eventually become, in its way, profound. Obi-Wan Kenobi was everything Qui-Gon had not been in terms of his relationship with the Jedi Order's institutional culture. Where Qui-Gon had trusted the living force over the Council's wisdom, Obi-Wan was fundamentally a Jedi's Jedi, someone who believed in the code, who respected the hierarchy, who found his security in the structure of the Order and its teachings rather than in the more improvisational approach his own master had modeled. He was deeply capable. He was genuinely intelligent. He would eventually become one of the most celebrated Jedi of his era, but he was not Qui-Gon. Anakin knew this from the first day. He did not resent Obi-Wan for it. He was not petty enough for that kind of displacement. But he felt the difference acutely in those early months and years, felt the shift from the warmth of Qui-Gon's particular brand of belief to Obi-Wan's more structured and measured approach to mentorship. Obi-Wan cared about him. This was real, and it was true, and it never really stopped being true through everything that followed. But Obi-Wan's way of expressing care was more restrained, more focused on discipline and progress and the acquisition of skills, and less focused on the kind of unconditional personal affirmation that Qui-Gon had given Anakin in the brief time they had together, and that Shmi had given him all his life. For a child who had developed his sense of self-worth largely through connection and love, and who was now navigating a completely foreign environment while processing multiple unresolved losses, this difference in style was more significant than it might have looked from the outside. Anakin worked hard. He was brilliant. He advanced faster than any Padawan in the Temple's recent memory. His Force abilities were extraordinary in scope and in ease. Things that took other students months of effort came to him in days. He absorbed combat training with a facility that left his instructors occasionally unsettled. He was clearly exceptional. He was also clearly struggling. The Jedi Code was not designed for someone like Anakin. It was designed, over the millennia, for initiates brought into the temple as infants, before strong personal attachments had fully formed, before the emotional architecture of the self had been built primarily around specific relationships. Those children were raised inside the temple's culture from the beginning. They were formed by it. The code's requirement to release attachment, to feel emotion without clinging to it, to let go of fear and grief and love as possessive forces, to be a servant of the Force rather than a prisoner of personal need. All of this was something those initiates grew into gradually, and with support, starting from a developmental stage where the work of letting go had not yet been made infinitely harder by years of loving someone with everything you had, in a context where losing them was always one transaction away. Anakin came to the code at 9 years old, having already loved and lost and loved and feared losing in ways that had shaped him to his core. He was being asked to restructure himself around a philosophy of detachment while still carrying every attachment he had ever formed. He tried. He genuinely tried. But the tools the code offered for managing his particular kind of emotional weight were insufficient, not because the code was wrong in some absolute sense, but because it was not designed for his situation, and no one in the temple had the combination of insight and authority to recognize that and adapt accordingly. He thought about his mother every day. This is not a poetic statement. It is simply what was true. Every day, behind the discipline of his training, behind the hours of lightsaber practice and meditation and study, behind the performance of progress and growth that the temple required of him and that he genuinely was achieving in all its external forms, there was his mother. There was Shmi, still on Tatooine, still owned, still on the other side of an impossible distance. He did not know how she was. He could not know. He had no connection to her except the one that lived in him. The love that had been the entire foundation of his emotional world before the Jedi arrived and remade everything. The code said to let go. He could not let go. He had tried the letting go. What he found when he tried was not peace. What he found was the specific terror of someone whose entire previous life had taught him that the things he loved were always at risk, and that the only power he had ever had over that risk was the love itself, the holding on, the refusing to accept the distance as permanent. Letting go felt like abandonment. Letting go felt like what happened when the ship left Tatooine, and he watched his mother get smaller through the viewport. He could not do it again. He could not choose it. So he did not let go. He held on, and he learned to hold on quietly. In the private space that slavery had taught him to maintain, in the interior where no one could reach. He was 17 when Padme Amidala re-entered his life, and by then he had been carrying all of this for 8 years. 8 years is a long time. 8 years of daily practice in the suppression of the things he actually felt. 8 years of learning to present a face of Jedi composure over an interior life of unresolved grief and love and fear. 8 years of brilliant achievement that never quite touched the thing underneath the achievement. He had become an exceptional Jedi Padawan by every measurable standard. He had also become very good at the particular skill that was most dangerous for someone with his emotional architecture. The skill of performing being fine while not being fine at all. When he saw Padme again on Coruscant, something shifted in him that he had no defense against and had not thought to prepare for. He had thought about her over the years in the way that a child thinks about someone who was kind to them at a critical moment, with the specific kind of loyalty that forms when kindness arrives in the middle of difficulty and therefore carries extra weight. She had been part of the memory of the last time he had been with his mother, part of the brief brightness of the days before Qui-Gon died, before everything changed. She had been preserved in him at 9 years old as the angel he had named her. She was a senator now. She was 24 to his 17, and she was more fully herself than the girl he had met. More confident and more certain and more present in the specific way of people who have been tested and have not broken. She was also, immediately and undeniably, someone he could not look at without his composure becoming complicated. What he felt for Padme Amidala was not a simple thing, and it would be a mistake to reduce it to adolescent infatuation. Something real was happening when he looked at her. Something that lived in the same register as everything else he had never been permitted to keep. She was the embodiment of a category of feeling the Jedi Code had been trying to teach him was dangerous. Not because feeling was wrong, but because the Jedi believed that attachment to specific beings in the way Anakin attached to things was a path toward the dark side, toward the desperation that turned love into possession and possession into violence. He felt it anyway. He felt it without control and without the benefit of having any adequate language within the Jedi framework for what to do with it. He was assigned to protect her. This was practical necessity. Senator Amidala had received death threats serious enough for the Council to assign protection, and Anakin and Obi-Wan were among those assigned. He spent time with her. He talked to her. And everything he had been holding back for 8 years, the need for genuine connection, the hunger for someone to whom he could be real, the longing for the kind of unconditional love that his mother had given him and that nothing in the temple had replaced, all of it oriented itself toward Padme Amidala and locked on with the precision of someone whose heart had been looking for a target for a very long time. He told her things he probably should not have told her. He pushed too hard. He said too much. He was 17 and in love for the first time, and he had none of the emotional regulation that might have allowed him to navigate that more gracefully. She told him gently and firmly that this was not something that could happen. She was a senator. He was a Jedi. The rules of both their worlds said the same thing. This was impossible. He needed to let go of it. He could not let go of it. He had never been able to let go of anything that mattered to him. That was the central truth of Anakin Skywalker. The thing that was simultaneously his greatest gift and his most dangerous quality. He loved without half measures. He held without releasing. He could not be trained out of it because it was not a behavior. It was the structure of who he was. It was what slavery had made of him, the only form of power available to someone who had no power over anything. The refusal to relinquish the interior claim, even when everything exterior had been taken. He had held on to his mother that way for 8 years across an entire galaxy. He would hold on to Padme the same way, and then the dreams began. He started dreaming about his mother while they were on Naboo. He had been sent with Padme to her home planet, while Obi-Wan followed the investigation into the assassination attempts, and Naboo was green and alive and full of water in the way that only people who grew up on desert planets can truly appreciate. It was beautiful. It was a place where it should have been easy to breathe, and he could not breathe easily because the dreams kept coming. And the dreams were about Shmi. They were not peaceful dreams. They were not the kind of dream where you see someone you miss and wake up with a warm and melancholy afterglow. They were the kind of dream that has texture and urgency, that leaves residue, that communicates something through means beyond ordinary sleep imagery. He dreamed of her in pain. He dreamed of her in the dark. He dreamed of her reaching for something she could not find. The dreams came every night. And every night, they carried the same message. Even if the details changed, something is wrong. She needs you. You are not there. He was not sleeping. He was not eating the way he should have been eating. He was carrying this growing certainty that something was happening to his mother on Tatooine that he could not see or stop or fix, and that certainty was pressing on everything else in him. He told Padme about it. He told her he was having the dreams and that he thought they were real, that the Force was showing him something, that his mother was suffering. He needed to go to Tatooine. He knew he should ask Obi-Wan. He knew the proper protocol. He knew that as a Padawan he was supposed to follow his master's guidance, and that going to Tatooine without authorization was exactly the kind of emotional decision the Jedi Code was supposed to prevent him from making. He knew all of this, and he went anyway, because the dreams had given him no other possible choice. Some things live below the level where codes and protocols and institutional expectations can reach. His mother was in those depths. She had always been in those depths. Nothing the Jedi had taught him had changed that. It had only taught him to hide it better, and hiding had reached its limit. He and Padme landed on Tatooine in secret. He found Watto first, who told him that he had sold Shmi some years before to a moisture farmer named Cliegg Lars, who had then freed her and married her. She was no longer a slave. This information should have been relief, and it was, partially. But the dreams had not stopped, and the dreams did not stop for people who had been freed and were living peacefully, and the relief carried an undercurrent of urgency that would not quiet. He found the Lars homestead on the flat desert horizon, the underground living space, the moisture evaporators extending upward from the sand. He found Cliegg Lars, a solid and honest man now confined to a hoverchair because he had lost his leg trying to find Shmi. He found Owen Lars, Cliegg's son, and a young woman named Beru, who would eventually, in another time and another story, become the most important person in the life of the son Anakin had not yet had. He found a family. A real family. One that had formed around his mother in the years after she was freed, and he found that they had not been able to find her. Sand people had taken her. Tusken Raiders, a month ago. Cliegg had organized a search party of 30 men and lost most of them and come back without her. He was broken by it. Genuinely broken, in the way of a man who loved his wife and could not save her, and was sitting every day in the knowledge of what that meant. He told Anakin that she was probably already gone. He told him that holding on was only making the pain worse. He told him to let go. Anakin could not let go. He took a speeder into the desert alone at night. He followed the Force. He followed the thread that connected him to his mother through whatever distance existed between them. That thread that had never broken in 10 years across an entire galaxy, that he had carried through every day of training and every sleepless night of suppression and every attempt by the Order's teachings to convince him that the healthy thing was to release it. He followed it into the desert, and it led him to the Tusken camp, a cluster of tents in the shadow of rocky formations, populated by beings who lived in the harshest environment in the Outer Rim and had been shaped by it into something that the civilized galaxy did not know how to think about. Violent and tribal, and operating by codes too alien for most of the beings who feared them to understand. He moved through the camp in silence. He opened the tent he was drawn to, and he found his mother. Shmi Skywalker Lars was tied to a frame inside the tent. She had been beaten. She had been held captive for a month under conditions that the physical state of her when he found her made clear without requiring description. She was barely alive. She had been barely alive for a long time and had simply continued to be barely alive through will or through some deeper mechanism, perhaps through the same force that had given her son his impossible midichlorian count, perhaps through the knowledge that was somehow communicated across the desert, and the years, and the impossible distance that he was coming. He cut her down. He held her. And she opened her eyes. She saw him. She knew it was him. She said his name, and she touched his face, and she told him that she loved him. And she told him that she was so proud of him. And she told him that she was not afraid. And then she died in his arms. She died in his arms on the floor of a Tusken tent in the desert. outside Mos Espa, while the two suns set somewhere beyond the canvas walls. And the thing that happened inside Anakin Skywalker in that moment is not possible to describe with precision, because it exists beyond the language that ordinary loss generates. This was not grief in any form he had experienced before. This was not the grief of Qui-Gon's death, devastating as that had been. This was the specific and catastrophic destruction of the foundational structure, the thing that everything else had been built on. The first love, the unconditional love, the love that had held him together through slavery and the leaving and the training and the loneliness and the code and the suppression and the 10 years of distance. It was gone. She was gone. And then something else came in through the space where the grief was. It came fast. It came like fire. It came the way things come when they have been waiting for a crack in the wall long enough to stop waiting. Rage, pure and structural, and without limit. He had spent 10 years in an order that taught him to manage his emotions, and he had managed them, and he had suppressed them, and he had built the kind of carefully constructed inner composure that the Jedi Code required, and all of it dissolved in the space of seconds. The rage did not ask for permission. The rage did not wait for meditation or counsel or any of the tools the temple had given him for exactly this kind of moment. The rage simply was. He stood up. He walked out of the tent. He ignited his lightsaber. What he did in that camp will never appear in any Jedi record as anything other than a dark side atrocity, which it was, and that framing is accurate. And it is also incomplete, because the being who walked through that camp was not someone who had lost his way in a moment of weakness. He was someone who had never been given the architecture to survive this moment. He was the child who had been taken from his mother at 9 years old and promised that the Jedi would help him become something extraordinary, and the something extraordinary had been built on a foundation that included the belief, never spoken but always operative, that she was still there, that she was still alive, that there was still time. He had lived for 10 years on the structural assumption that there was still time. And now there was no time. And the only thing he had left was the rage. He killed them. He killed all of them. Men, women, children. He killed every living thing in that camp, and he kept killing until there was nothing left to kill. And then he stood in the silence of what he had done and felt something that he would spend years trying to understand, and that he would never fully account for. He felt it, and he did not stop it. He stood in it, and then he carried it back to the Lars homestead, and he carried it down the steps into the living space, and he sat across from Padme, and she looked at his face, and she knew something had happened that she did not yet have words for. He told her. He told her everything he had done. He told her that they were animals, and that he had killed them, and that he was not sorry. He told her that he had failed. He told her that a Jedi was supposed to be better than this. He said all of this, and he wept, the kind of weeping that comes from beneath the places where crying usually starts, the kind that is physical and total, and that has been building for longer than the immediate event. He wept for his mother. He wept for what he had done. He wept for what he was discovering about himself in the aftermath of the worst night of his life. Padme did not leave. She sat with him. She did not tell him it was okay, and she did not tell him it was not okay. She simply stayed, and in the staying, she gave him the only thing that had ever actually helped Anakin Skywalker survive anything. The funeral for Shmi Lars took place in the desert at the Lars homestead. Klieg said words over her grave that were true and that acknowledged her courage and her life and her freedom, the freedom she had earned and briefly lived. He said she had been free and loved. It was the best possible version of how her story could have ended, and it was devastating anyway. Anakin stood at the grave and looked down at the sand and held every broken piece of himself together by force of will, in the specific way that people who have survived impossible things survive them, not by transcending the pain, but by finding, somewhere in the rubble, a reason to keep standing. He buried his mother in the desert. He buried part of himself there too, though he did not know yet how significant a part. What went into the ground alongside Shmi Skywalker was not just grief. It was the last piece of the original Anakin, the slave boy who had loved without reservation and trusted that the love would be returned, and assumed, without ever fully examining the assumption, that the universe would not take everything from him at once. That boy had died in the Tusken camp with the woman who had made him. What would stand up from the grave and walk away from Tatooine was something older and harder, and carrying a secret that would live inside him for years. He had felt the dark side that night. He had felt it the way you feel, something that fits your hand perfectly. And the perfect fit was the most frightening thing about it. It did not feel foreign. It did not feel like a mistake he had stumbled into. It felt like something that had been waiting for him in a place just underneath his training, patient and available, offering a version of power that the Jedi Code offered no equivalent to, the power to make sure this never happened again, the power to never be helpless in the face of loss, the power to protect the things he loved by becoming something the universe could not take those things from. He would not admit this to himself clearly. Not yet. He would file it under grief and crisis and an exceptional circumstance that the Jedi teachings were not designed to handle, and he would return to Coruscant and resume his training and his life with the same face of composure he had been maintaining for 10 years. And underneath the composure, the thing would sit, no longer entirely quiet, no longer entirely hidden, waiting for the next moment when the walls became thin enough for it to push through again. There would be more moments. The galaxy was moving toward a crisis that no one fully saw coming, and Anakin Skywalker was moving toward a crisis of his own that was even less visible. The war was coming. And wars have a way of creating exactly the conditions that break the things in people that were already cracked. He had been broken in the desert on Tatooine the night his mother died. He had been broken before that. By her absence, by Qui-Gon's death, by the Council's rejection, by the Code's demands, by the fundamental incompatibility between who he was and what the Order needed him to become. He had been broken across 10 years by the specific and patient accumulation of wounds that each individually might have been survivable, but that together had created a damage map with no clear path to healing. The Jedi had given him skills and discipline and a framework and a purpose. They had not given him the thing that might have actually saved him. They had not given him someone who could look at all of it honestly and say, "This is what you carry. This is how heavy it is. This is what we are going to do together about the weight." Nobody had done that. Qui-Gon had come closest, and Qui-Gon was dead. So Anakin Skywalker carried it alone. He was 19 years old, and he carried it alone across the galaxy toward a war that would test everything already damaged in him, and find, again and again, the places where the damage ran deepest. He carried it the way he had always carried, things he could not put down, Without letting go, the Clone Wars began on Geonosis. And Geonosis was the kind of beginning that tells you everything you need to know about what a thing really is underneath its official story. The official story of the Clone Wars was that the separatist movement, led by Count Dooku and backed by thousands of solar systems that had grown tired of the Republic's corruption and inefficiency, had assembled a droid army large enough to threaten galactic stability, and that the Republic had responded by deploying a clone army that nobody in the Senate had known existed until the moment it was needed, and that the war that followed was a necessary defense of democracy against the forces of disorder. That story was true in its details and false in its architecture. Because what was actually happening on Geonosis, and what would continue to happen across 3 years of war in 100 different systems, was a managed catastrophe. A machine built by a man who understood, with a patience that made the breadth of his manipulation almost incomprehensible, that chaos was only useful to the people who controlled it from the outside. Anakin did not know this. Nobody on the Jedi side knew this. What they knew was that Obi-Wan had been captured, that the Separatists had a droid foundry on Geonosis capable of producing armies, and that Padme had looked at Anakin on a Republic gunship and told him that she loved him. She had said it the way people say things they have decided to say because they may be about to die, and the withholding no longer makes sense in the face of that. The gunship was descending into a battle neither of them was certain they would survive. She said it, and he looked at her, and the universe rearranged itself around that sentence, and he said it back. And then they were in the arena, and the battle was already happening everywhere at once. He lost his arm on Geonosis. Count Dooku took it in the confrontation that followed the arena battle, a brief and humbling duel in which Anakin's ferocity and power were simply not enough to bridge the gap between his ability and Dooku's centuries of refined skill. He rushed in the way he always rushed in, on instinct and anger, and the irresistible forward momentum of someone who had never fully learned to fight defensively, because defensiveness required a kind of patience with the possibility of retreat that was psychologically inaccessible to him. Dooku met his charge and removed his sword arm below the elbow in a single precise movement, and Anakin went down. Obi-Wan went down too, cut across both thighs. Yoda arrived, and Dooku fled, and they were alive. But the arm was gone. He was fitted with a mechanical replacement on Coruscant, a prosthetic of such quality that its range of motion matched the original almost completely, and its sensitivity could be calibrated finely enough to feel the difference between textures. Technologically, it was remarkable. Psychologically, it was a beginning. The slow replacement of Anakin Skywalker with something less biological, less human, less fully in possession of the organic form he had been born with, had started. It would not end until there was almost nothing left of the original flesh. But that particular ending was still years away. For now, it was just an arm. And arms could be replaced. And the war was starting. And there was no time to sit with what the loss of his arm meant beyond its practical implications. He and Padme were married on Naboo, quietly, without witnesses, beyond the officiant, and R2-D2 and C3PO, who were present, because they were always present, and because telling them to leave would have required an explanation. It was a small ceremony in the gardens of her family's retreat, in the green and water-rich beauty of a planet that still felt, to Anakin, like a dream of what the universe could look like if it were allowed to be gentle. They were married, and then they were secret. carrying their marriage the way Anakin had always carried the things he was not permitted to have, in the private space, behind the face of composure, in the interior where no one could reach. He loved her, that must be said clearly, and held clearly, because it is easy, in the aftermath of knowing what their story becomes, to read his love for Padme retroactively as something other than what it was, to project the desperation of his later behavior backward over the genuine feeling that preceded it, and conclude that the feeling was always primarily about need, rather than love. That is not accurate. He loved her the way he had loved his mother, with the totality that was his fundamental nature. And he loved her specifically, not just as a vessel for his emotional needs, but as the particular person she was. The senator who fought for people who had no voice. The woman who had been a queen at 14 and carried the weight of that responsibility into everything she did. The person who had sat with him in the Lars homestead after the worst night of his life and stayed. She was real to him. She was not a projection. The love was real. But the love was also the most vulnerable structure in his entire interior life, because he had already lost the person he loved most once, and he had not survived that loss intact. And now he had given that same depth of love to someone else. And the part of him that had been shaped by everything Tatooine had taught him about the relationship between love and loss was already underneath the joy and the marriage and the war, running its quiet calculations about what would happen if she were taken too. The Clone Wars lasted 3 years. 3 years of a kind of sustained intensity that most human beings do not encounter across the course of entire lifetimes. Battle after campaign, after strategic crisis, after humanitarian disaster, after atrocity in one quadrant followed immediately by a different atrocity in another quadrant, with barely enough time between engagements to clean the damage before the next engagement began. Anakin fought through all of it. He fought brilliantly. He fought in ways that made him a legend in his own time. A general who inspired a fanatical loyalty in the clone troopers, who served under him because he led from the front, because he shared the danger, because he made decisions in the field with a speed and an accuracy that saved lives, even when the situations he was navigating should not have been navigable. He became known. He became famous. The HoloNet called him the hero with no fear. The name was accurate in all the wrong ways. He was not without fear. He was simply skilled by now at not showing it. The fear lived where it had always lived, in the private space, and what appeared on the surface in its place was something that looked like fearlessness, because the speed of his decision-making and the completeness of his commitment to each action he took left no visible room for hesitation. But hesitation and fear are not the same thing. You can be terrified and still move without hesitation. You can carry enormous dread in the part of yourself that no one sees and still present the face of someone who is unafraid. Anakin had been doing this since he was 9 years old. He was exceptionally good at it. The war cost him things that no citation or rank or reputation could account for. It cost him in the currency that wars always extract from the people who fight them. The specific losses that accumulate into a weight that eventually changes the shape of a person permanently. He watched clone troopers he had come to know die. He watched Jedi he had grown up alongside fall. He made decisions in the field that no amount of skill or force guidance could make clean decisions about which lives to risk and how to allocate resources in situations where the allocation was never going to leave everyone alive, and he lived with the consequences of those decisions in the way that field commanders live with them, which is to say, without adequate space to process them, and with another engagement always already approaching. He was given a Padawan. Her name was Ahsoka Tano, and she arrived as an assignment he had not requested and initially did not want. A Togruta girl who was young and eager and possessed of a confidence that was at least partially a performance, which he recognized because he had been doing the same performance for years. He was not immediately warm to her. He was not entirely sure he was ready to be someone's master when he sometimes felt, in the quieter moments, that he was still very much someone who needed one. But Ahsoka did not wait for him to be ready. She simply showed up, completely herself, and demanded by her presence alone that he respond to who she actually was, rather than to the idea of a Padawan he had not asked for. She became, over the years of the war, one of the most important relationships of his life. She was not his mother, and she was not Padme, and the nature of his attachment to her was different from both of those, but it was genuine, and it was deep, and it was shaped by what the teaching relationship had taught him about the difference between caring for someone you are responsible for and caring for someone whose development you are personally invested in. He was invested in her. He watched her grow. He pushed her harder than was comfortable because he knew she could take it, and because he believed in her in the particular way that Qui-Gon had believed in him, with the conviction that this was someone the Force had put in front of him for a reason, and that the reason was real and worth honoring. And then she left. She left in the worst possible way, not by dying, which would have been a grief he knew how to carry, but by choosing to go. She had been framed for a bombing at the Jedi Temple, accused of a crime she had not committed, and the Jedi Order had expelled her and handed her over to a Republic military tribunal rather than standing behind their own Padawan while the truth was still being established. Anakin had fought for her within the system. He had investigated. He had found the truth. He had brought it back to the Council in time to save her. And then the Council had offered her return, as if the expulsion had simply been a regrettable error, a procedural mistake, something to move past. Now that the facts were clear, she did not move past it. She looked at the Council, and she looked at the Jedi, and she thought about what it meant that the institution she had given her life to had handed her over to a military tribunal rather than protecting her. And she walked away. She took off the symbols of her rank, and she set them on the steps, and she left the Order. Anakin stood and watched her go the way he had stood and watched ships leave before, with the specific helplessness of someone who knows that the right thing and the possible thing are not the same thing, and who cannot change that fact through any amount of will or force or love. He did not try to stop her. He understood, with the part of himself that had always understood about people leaving, that stopping her would have been the wrong kind of holding on. But he felt it. He felt her leave, and he filed it in the place where all the leaving went, in the accumulating archive of things that had been taken from him or that had chosen to go, and he carried it the way he carried everything else, forward in motion, toward the next battle and the next engagement and the next situation that required the performance of someone who was managing just fine. He was managing less fine than anyone around him knew. Through all of this, one relationship remained constant in a way that nothing else in his life did. Palpatine had first met Anakin on Naboo when Anakin was 9 years old, and had taken a specific interest in him from that initial encounter that had never wavered in the years since. He was the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, one of the most powerful political figures in the galaxy. A man whose time was structured by the demands of governing a civilization at war, and he made regular time for Anakin Skywalker. He invited him to private conversations in his office, overlooking Coruscant. He attended Anakin's performances in the training halls when Anakin was young. He asked him questions that were genuinely interested in the answers. He listened, understand what this meant to Anakin within the context of his relational history. This was the most powerful man in the Republic, taking a consistent, personal, non-institutional interest in who Anakin was and how he was doing. Not what rank he had achieved, not what his midi-chlorian count implied about his potential, not what the prophecy said about his destiny, who he was specifically and individually, as a person. The question Palpatine asked more than any other, asked with a consistency that eventually became its own form of intimacy, was how Anakin was feeling, what he was thinking, what troubled him, what he wanted. Nobody in the Jedi Order asked Anakin these questions. That is not an accusation. It is simply a description of the institutional culture. The Jedi did not, as a general practice, conduct regular check-ins on the interior emotional lives of their members in the way Palpatine conducted them with Anakin. The code provided a framework for managing emotional life. But the management was largely self-directed. You meditated. You practiced detachment. You sought counsel from your master when the formal relationship structure made that appropriate. You did not typically sit across from a senior figure in the order who asked you, with genuine curiosity, what kept you awake at night. Palpatine asked exactly that. And Anakin told him, not everything, not the full truth of the massacre on Tatooine, or the depth of his secret marriage, or the complete inventory of everything the code said he was supposed to release, but had not released. But more than he told anyone else, more than he told Obi-Wan, with whom he had the closest and most enduring bond of his Jedi life. He told Palpatine things because Palpatine had created, over years of patient cultivation, the only space in Anakin's life that felt genuinely safe for the kind of honesty that lives below performance. And the warmth Anakin felt toward him was not manufactured. It was real. It was the warmth of someone who had been starved of a certain kind of attention and had finally found a consistent source of it. He did not know, because he could not have known what was being built inside those conversations. He did not know that each admission, each confidence shared, each piece of his genuine interior offered to the man he thought of as a mentor and a friend was being received and catalogued and carefully incorporated into a model of Anakin Skywalker that was being constructed not out of care, but out of strategic precision. He did not know that the warmth he felt was being returned by a being who did not experience warmth in any form Anakin would have recognized, but who had spent decades learning to simulate it with enough accuracy to fool the most force-sensitive beings in the galaxy. He did not know that he was being prepared. He did not know that everything Palpatine had ever said to him was a step in a sequence that had been planned before Anakin was born. Possibly long before. He knew none of this. He only knew that Palpatine felt, in the specific and irreplaceable way, that this particular absence had always made itself known, like what it might have felt like to have a father. In the third year of the war, Anakin began to dream again. The dreams were about Padme. They had the same quality as the dreams about his mother years before. The same urgency, the same communicative precision that went beyond ordinary dream imagery into something that felt sourced from outside the self. He dreamed of her in a medical facility, in white light, in the specific posture of someone who was dying. He dreamed of her face and the life going out of it. He dreamed of childbirth and loss. He dreamed the same dream again and again, with small variations in the details, but with the same essential information at the center of each one. She was carrying his child. She had told him this, and the joy of it had been enormous and real, and had briefly, for the space of the moments in which the joy was fresh, pushed everything else to the periphery. He was going to be a father. He was going to have the thing that had been taken from him at birth. A family, a unit, a structure in which the people he loved were collected together in one place where he could be present and where love did not require the terror of distance. He had held the joy of it. And then the dreams had started, and the joy had been poisoned by them, the way everything good in his life eventually developed its shadow. He tried what the Jedi training had given him for managing this. He meditated. He attempted, genuinely attempted, to practice the release that the code said was the correct response to the fear of loss. He went to Yoda and he asked him, carefully and without exposing the full truth of his situation, about what a Jedi should do when they dreamed of someone they loved dying. He phrased it abstractly. He was still protecting the secret of his marriage, still maintaining the careful performance of a Jedi who was managing his attachments appropriately, because exposing the truth would have meant exposing the marriage and the child. And every year of the secret life, he and Padme had been living beneath the surface of their public roles. Yoda told him what the code said. He said that death was a natural part of life, and that grief was not something to be resisted, but that clinging to those we loved, trying to protect them from the natural course of things through the force of our will, led only to suffering. He said to train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose. He said it with the kind of authority that comes from having watched this same dynamic play out across centuries. The authority of someone who was genuinely wise about the general pattern, even if he was missing the specific information that would have made his guidance applicable to the actual situation he was being asked about. Anakin heard it. He heard it, and he felt the familiar impossibility of it. The same wall he had encountered every time the code had directed him toward release. He thanked Yoda. He walked out, and he went looking for another answer. The other answer existed because Palpatine had been preparing it for years. There was a Sith legend. Palpatine mentioned it to Anakin one evening in the opera house, in the curved and private space of his box, surrounded by the abstract beauty of a Mon Calamari performance. Neither of them was watching. He called it the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. He described it as a legend of someone who had become so powerful in his understanding of the Force that he could keep those he cared about from dying. He could influence the midi-chlorians. He could create life and prevent death. He had discovered something the Jedi would consider unnatural, because the Jedi feared those aspects of the Force that could be used to do what the living so desperately wanted to do. He had learned to cheat death. Anakin sat with that. He let it settle. He turned it over carefully, the way he turned over anything mechanical, feeling for its shape, for what it was really made of, for what it actually offered beneath what it appeared to offer on the surface. And then he asked the question that Palpatine had been waiting years for him to ask. He asked if it was possible to learn this power. Palpatine said it was not a power the Jedi would teach. He paused. He let the weight of what he was not saying fill the space between them. And he said something that he had been building toward across every conversation they had ever had. Every carefully calibrated admission of warmth, every question about Anakin's inner life, every moment of performing the father figure role for a man who had needed one since childhood. He suggested that if Anakin wanted to learn the full potential of the Force, all of it, not just the portion the Jedi considered safe and acceptable, he might need to go to a place the Jedi would not follow. He planted the seed and let it germinate. He was in no rush. He had been not in a rush for decades. The galaxy was almost exactly where he needed it to be. The Council appointed Anakin to the Chancellor's security detail, which was straightforwardly political on both sides. Palpatine had requested Anakin specifically. The Council agreed, but they added their own request alongside the appointment. They asked Anakin to report back to them on Palpatine's activities, to function in effect as a spy within the relationship. They said the Chancellor had accrued too much executive power during the war. They said they were concerned. They said they trusted Anakin. He did not feel trusted. He felt used. He had been placed in an impossible position between the institution he had served his entire adult life and the man who had been the closest thing to a father he had ever known. And the institution was asking him to betray the man in the name of a trust they were simultaneously demonstrating they did not fully have in him. And they demonstrated that lack of trust in the same meeting by doing the other thing, the thing that cut deeper than the spy request, because it went to the core of everything Anakin had been reaching for across his years of service. They appointed him to the Jedi High Council as Palpatine's representative. But they did not grant him the rank of Jedi Master. He sat in the council chamber and heard this, and felt it land in the specific way that the things designed to wound him had always managed to land, in the place beneath the composure, in the accumulated history of being assessed and found insufficient by the people whose judgment he most needed to meet. A seat on the council without the rank of master was unprecedented. It was essentially a message. You are useful enough to occupy this seat for the political purpose we require it for. You are not, as we understand these things, what a Jedi Master is. You are too full of what you have always been too full of to sit here as an equal. You can sit here as a representative, as an instrument, but not as one of us. He told them it was outrageous, and he told them it was unfair, and he was right on both counts. And he knew, even as he said it, that saying it would not change anything, that the council had made its determination and would not be moved by his frustration. And then he said something that revealed exactly how far the fracture had progressed. He said he would do what they asked, and he said it with the tone of someone who was beginning the interior work of deciding which of the competing authorities in his life he was actually loyal to, a decision he had not yet fully reached, but that was already underway. Obi-Wan found him afterward. Obi-Wan, who knew him better than anyone in the Order, who had watched him grow from the 9-year-old boy on the landing platform into this, looked at him and saw things that Anakin was not showing, and said what he said anyway. He was not qualified to be on the council. The fact of his being placed there was already irregular. He needed to accept what was offered and demonstrate through patience that he was worthy of more. He said it the way Obi-Wan said things, with clarity and with care, but also with the particular limitation of someone whose own formation had been so thoroughly Jedi that the emotional reality of what he was asking Anakin to accept was genuinely outside his full comprehension. Anakin could not make Obi-Wan understand. He had never fully been able to make Obi-Wan understand in the way that Qui-Gon had understood without requiring explanation. And the distance between them on this was one of the quiet, persistent sorrows of Anakin's life within the Order. He loved Obi-Wan. He admired him. He trusted his combat judgment and his wisdom. In all the ways the Order measured wisdom. But there was a thing in Anakin that Obi-Wan could see but could not reach, and both of them knew it, and neither of them could bridge it from their respective sides. He went back to Padme that night. He told her about the council. He told her about the rank. He sat in the apartment with the Coruscant skyline behind the windows, and he let some of what he was actually feeling show in his face, which was something he did almost nowhere else. She read him. She always read him better than anyone in the Jedi Order had ever managed, because she was paying attention to him as a person rather than as a Force sensitive or a Padawan or a symbol or a problem to be managed. She listened. She did not minimize. She did not tell him he was wrong to feel what he was feeling. But she also heard something in what he was saying that frightened her. She heard the edge in it. She heard the place where frustration tipped towards something darker, where the accumulating grievances against the Order and the accumulating fear for her life and the accumulating pressure of the secret life they were living and the dreams that would not stop came together into a particular quality of desperation. She was pregnant with his child, and she was loved by him, and she was frightened of him in the specific way of someone who loves a person and can see, clearly and with grief, a direction in which that person is heading that the person themselves cannot see. She said something to him about democracy. She said she was afraid of where the Republic was going, afraid of the concentration of power in the Chancellor's office. He said something in response that she did not expect. He said that if the Jedi were not able to stop the Sith, someone with the wisdom and the power to use it well might need to take control to make things work. He said it as a political theory. He said it in a way that had the sound of something he had been thinking privately for some time. She looked at him. She said she did not recognize him. He could not hear her. Not yet. He was too far into the current to have the perspective on where it was taking him. Everything accelerated when General Grievous, the cyborg commander of the Separatist military, was located on Utapau. Obi-Wan was sent to engage him. This meant Anakin was on Coruscant when Palpatine made his move. He called Anakin to his office, alone, and he told him something that only the Sith knew. He told Anakin he was the Sith. Lord the Jedi had been hunting for over a decade. He said it plainly and without prevarication, the way someone says a thing when they are not asking permission and are not afraid of the response. He said he was Darth Sidious. He said the Sith were not what the Jedi had taught Anakin to believe they were. He said the dark side was not simply a corruption of the Force, but another path through it, one that offered powers the Jedi denied, because the Jedi were afraid of them, because the Jedi had built their philosophy around a series of prohibitions that served the institution more than they served the living beings who practiced within it. He said the dark side could save Padme from the death Anakin had dreamed of. He was the only one who knew how. Anakin ignited his lightsaber. He held it at Palpatine's throat. His hands were shaking. His hands had not shaken in battle in years, but they shook now, because the man in front of him was simultaneously the Sith Lord. The Jedi had been hunting, and the closest thing to a father he had ever had, and both of those things were true at once. And the person who held his lightsaber at the man's throat was also the person who had shared more of himself with this man than with anyone else in his life. And all of that lived in the same body and the same moment. and could not be separated into clean categories. He went to Mace Windu, he told him. He reported the location of the Sith Lord, the way the Order had trained him to report intelligence. And then he stayed behind when Windu and 3 other masters went to arrest Palpatine. Stayed behind because Windu had told him to. Because even in this moment, the hierarchical habits of a lifetime were still operative. He did not stay behind. He could not. He stood in the corridor and he felt the pull of what was happening in the Chancellor's office with more force than he had felt anything since Tatooine. And the pull was not toward justice or toward the completion of the Jedi mission. The pull was toward Padme, toward the knowledge that whatever happened in that room was the last possible moment in which the question of whether she lived or died might still be answerable. The dreams were still running. The dreams had not stopped. And there was a man in that room who had told him he could answer that question. And that man was about to be killed by a Jedi Master. And if he was killed, the answer died with him. He went. He found what he found. Palpatine, diminished somehow, face altered by what Mace Windu had done to him, held in place at the window by the blade Windu had pressed toward him. Windu was saying something about the Senate and about justice and about the Sith never having the opportunity to manipulate the Republic again. He was right. He was right about everything he was saying. And the man at the end of his blade was the architect of 3 years of war and the engineer of the Clone Wars from both sides and the designer of a trap that had been building for decades. Windu was right. Anakin said he needed to stand trial. He said it from the doorway. He said it because he believed it, and also because he needed Palpatine alive for reasons that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with Padme. Windu said some things were too dangerous to be left to trial. He said it with the particular certainty of a man who had spent a lifetime in a role that required him to make exactly these kinds of judgments and who trusted his judgment completely. And in the instant before he completed the movement that would have ended it, Anakin ignited his blade. He cut off Mace Windu's hand. He had not decided to do it. That is the important thing. He had not arrived at the office with a plan. He had not reasoned his way to a conclusion and acted on the reasoning. He had reached the end of himself. And beyond the end, there was only the thing underneath everything, the terror of losing Padme, the absolute refusal that lived below every other operative principle in his life, the thing that slavery had installed at the foundation of him that said there are things you do not let go of, there are people you do not leave behind, there are losses you do not accept. He had reached that foundation and acted from it. In the space of a second, before any of the reasoning could catch up, Palpatine unleashed lightning through the window that Windu had opened. Mace Windu fell. The silence that followed was absolute in the way that silences after catastrophic things tend to be. Anakin stood in the middle of what he had done, and he looked at his hands, and he understood with a clarity that came from the specific quality of horror that arrives when you see yourself do something you cannot take back. Exactly what had just happened. He had betrayed the Jedi Order. He had committed an act against one of its most senior members. He had become something in the space of a single second that 10 years of training had been designed to prevent him from becoming. He said it. He said he did not know what he had done. Palpatine told him. Palpatine, who had been waiting for this exact moment since before Anakin was born, told him what he had done. He said Anakin's destiny was fulfilled. He said the Jedi had stood in the way of everything Anakin was capable of becoming. He said he could teach him the power that would save Padme. He said all Anakin had to do was pledge himself to the Sith. He did not decide. He knelt. The body completed the movement before the mind could negotiate the terms of it. He knelt because he had nothing else. Every structure he had built his life inside had just been destroyed in a single second of irreversible action. And the only structure left standing was Palpatine's. And inside it was the answer to the only question that still organized his entire interior world. He knelt, and he said he would do whatever Palpatine asked. And Palpatine gave him the name that the history books would remember: Darth Vader. What happened next is described in the records as Order 66. It looked like a systematic military operation, because that is what it was designed to look like. Clone commanders across hundreds of systems received the order simultaneously and executed it with the precision that clones had been engineered to bring to everything they did. Jedi generals across the galaxy were shot from behind by the soldiers who had served under them and trusted them and been trusted by them across 3 years of shared combat. Some died instantly. Some fought back. Most were simply gone. The moment of contact, too fast and too unexpected for the Force to provide adequate warning. Thousands of Jedi died in the first hours of Order 66. Thousands more in the days that followed. Anakin led the ground operation on Coruscant personally. He went to the Jedi Temple with 500 clone troopers, and he walked through its gates. And he did what Darth Sidious had instructed him to do. He did not falter at the door. He did not hesitate in the halls. He walked through the place where he had spent 10 years of his life, and he fulfilled the mission without the hesitation that should have been there, that in any other human being would have been there, because the part of him that might have hesitated had been excavated by everything that had come before this night. The fear for Padme, the dreams, the Council's rejection, the year of Palpatine's careful preparation, the second in Palpatine's office. All of it had done its work. He was not numb, he was directed. The direction was away from everything that could have stopped him and toward the thing that could not be turned back from. He encountered Jedi inside the temple, Jedi who had not yet received word of what was happening, who looked at one of their own walking toward them with clone troops and did not immediately understand what they were seeing. He did not give them time to understand. He moved through the temple, and the temple became a different kind of place. The place where the archive of an order died alongside the people who had maintained it. And Anakin Skywalker moved through the center of that dying and did not stop. He went to the youngling room. He stood in the doorway of the place where the Order's children sat. The initiates, the smallest ones, who had been brought to the temple before they were old enough to form the strong attachments that the code warned against, who had been raised entirely inside the Jedi framework and knew no other home. They looked at him. One of them asked what was happening. One of them asked if he was going to help them. He ignited his saber. This is the point in the story where the tragedy becomes complete, where it becomes impossible to see anything in what Anakin Skywalker has become that resembles the boy who was born on Tatooine. And it is also the point at which the cruelest truth of this whole story becomes most visible. Because the boy who was born on Tatooine would have done anything for those children. The boy who was born on Tatooine understood in his bones what it was to be small and powerless and dependent on the decisions of those who held the power. The boy who had been a slave would have recognized in an instant the absolute vulnerability of children who had no protection. And the fact that what had been done to Anakin Skywalker was thorough enough and deep enough and structural enough to bring him to that room and leave him capable of what he did there is the measure of how completely the tragedy had consumed everything that had once been the person underneath. He left the temple burning. He went to Mustafar on Palpatine's orders. The separatist leadership had been gathered there. The political and military architects of the Confederacy. The beings who had nominally led 3 years of war from the other side. Palpatine said they must be eliminated. He said it was the final step in ending the war. Anakin went to Mustafar, and he walked through the facility on the volcanic planet, and he did what he had been sent to do. And the doing of it was not complicated by anything anymore, by the war or the politics or any of the moral calculations that had once been part of his interior life. He was past those. He had gone through a door that could not be reopened from the other side. He sat alone afterward in the facility while the lava moved outside the windows. He reached out through the Force to Padme. He sent her his location. He said it was over and she should come to him. He said they would be together. He said everything was going to be different now. She came. She came alone except for the pilot droid, which she sent away. She came because she loved him and because she was frightened, and because she needed to see for herself what she had been seeing in his eyes for the past months. The thing she had not wanted to name, but that had become impossible to avoid naming. She stood in front of him on the landing platform above the lava fields, and she looked at him, and she saw it. She saw all of it. She saw the temple burning behind his eyes. She saw the children. She saw everything he had become and everything he had lost in the becoming, and she wept. She told him what she had heard, that he had turned against the Jedi, that he had gone to the temple. She asked him what he had done. She asked him in the specific and direct way of someone who already knew the answer and was asking anyway because the relationship required that she ask. He told her that he had done what had to be done. He said the Jedi were plotting against the Republic. He said this in a way that had the sound of something he had told himself enough times, that it had acquired the texture of belief even if it had not originated there. He said he could overthrow the Chancellor. He said they could rule together and bring order and peace to the galaxy. She heard him say it, and she heard what the saying of it revealed, and she said, the thing that people who love someone and are watching them disappear sometimes say, the last honest thing, the thing that names what is actually happening. She said he was breaking her heart. She said she didn't know who he was anymore. She said she was afraid of what he had become, and he heard it as betrayal. He heard her fear as a verdict. He heard her grief as an alignment against him, as something she was feeling on behalf of the people she believed he had wronged, rather than as something she was feeling out of love for who he had been. He heard it through the filter of every previous moment in his life, when he had loved someone completely, and felt the fear of losing them transform into the specific agony of watching them choose something other than staying. His mother had not chosen to leave, but she had been taken. Ahsoka had chosen to leave. The Jedi had been something he was always slightly outside of and never fully secure within. And now Padme was standing in front of him with fear in her face and tears on her face, and he heard the fear as leaving. Obi-Wan stepped out of the ship. He had been there, following Padme. Not to trap Anakin, but because he had known something that nobody else had admitted knowing, that this was where it was going, that this was the end point of everything that had been building since Geonosis, and probably since before. He had followed because he could not leave Anakin completely without following. Because whatever was between them, across all the years and all the training and all the moments of genuine connection and genuine friction, was not the kind of thing that allowed him simply to stop. He stepped out of the ship and he looked at Anakin, and everything that had ever been between them was in the looking. Anakin saw him and heard what his presence meant and felt it as confirmation of what he had already started to feel. He turned on Padme. He raised his hand, and he used the Force the way the dark side teaches Force to be used, as an extension of anger rather than as an expression of will. He choked her. He held her in the air with the Force, and he choked her until she lost consciousness and she fell. Obi-Wan told him to let her go, and he let her go, but the damage was already done. It had been done before this moment. This was only the moment where the damage became impossible to deny. The duel on Mustafar is the most painful thing in this entire story, and it is painful in a way that has nothing to do with the combat, which was extraordinary on both sides, technical and desperate and fueled by everything that two people who have spent years training together can bring to a fight when everything real is at stake. It is painful because of what it was underneath the fight. It was a conversation that had been unfinished for years, a conversation about what Anakin was and what the Jedi had given him and what they had failed to give him and what Palpatine had offered in the space the Order had left empty, conducted in the only language that remained available to both of them after the time for words had run out. Obi-Wan loved him. This needs to be said because it is true and because it is the most devastating thing about the duel, more devastating than any moment of the fight itself. He loved Anakin Skywalker in the way that people love, the people they have lived alongside and grown alongside and failed and succeeded alongside across years that were neither easy nor empty. He had not been able to give Anakin everything Anakin needed. He had not been equipped for that, but he had given what he had, and what he had was genuine and real, and he fought on that volcanic planet with tears in his eyes, which Jedi Masters are not supposed to have, because the person he was fighting was someone he had loved and had not been able to save. He won. The ground gave Obi-Wan the high position in the final moment, and Anakin, who had never learned to fight defensively, who had never been able to stop the forward momentum, leapt for him anyway, and Obi-Wan completed the movement that the moment required of him, and Anakin Skywalker fell to the bank of the lava river burning. What Obi-Wan said to him then, standing at the edge of the bank while Anakin burned, is something that neither of them would ever fully recover from. He said he had loved him. He said Anakin was his brother. He said it was not with the clean declarative emotion of a man making a statement. He said it the way someone says a thing that has been true all along, and that he is saying now because now is the only moment left to say it, because the person he is saying it to is burning, and he cannot fix the burning, and the only thing he has left to offer is the truth of how he felt. And then he picked up Anakin's lightsaber and he left. He could not stay. He could not watch the rest of it. He walked back to the ship where Padme lay unconscious, and he flew away from Mustafar with everything that remained of the people who had been central to Anakin Skywalker's life. And the planet burned behind him, and the person he had left on the bank burned with it. Palpatine came for Anakin. Palpatine, who had orchestrated every single moment that had led to this one, who had never cared about Anakin except as an instrument, came to Mustafar and pulled what was left of his instrument from the bank of the lava river and carried it to the medical facility where it could be preserved and rebuilt. He kept him alive for reasons of utility. He needed Darth Vader. He had spent decades building Darth Vader. The broken, burning thing on the bank of the lava river was the raw material, and raw materials were not abandoned simply because they had been damaged in the process. Padme was dying on the same facility where Anakin was being rebuilt. She had not been physically injured beyond what the Force choking had done, which the medical staff could treat. She was dying of something the medical droid's instruments could not locate with precision, something that existed in the register of will and spirit, rather than in the register of organ function. She was dying because the grief of what she had seen and what had happened, and what the man she loved had become, was something her body did not know how to survive. She delivered 2 children, a boy and a girl, and she named them before she went. Luke, Leia. She said, with the last things she said, that there was still good in him, that she knew it, that she was sure. She died believing that. Across everything she had seen on Mustafar, across the burning and the choking and the face of the person who had done those things, she died, holding on to the version of him that she had seen first and had never fully been able to stop seeing. She died the way she had lived, with a particular kind of faith that the world around her consistently failed to validate. On the operating table in a different part of the same facility, Anakin Skywalker was encased in the suit. It went on, piece by piece, with the methodical precision of machines performing medical reconstruction, and each piece removed him further from the form he had been born into and replaced it with something that breathed mechanically and perceived the world through filtered optical sensors and moved through the galaxy in a body that was more prosthetic than organic. The arm had been the beginning. This was the completion. The physical transformation was the external expression of the internal one, the becoming visible in the only material that remained, the body, because everything else had already changed. When the mask sealed and the first mechanical breath moved through the vocoder and out into the room, Palpatine told him that his anger had killed Padme, that in his fury he had caused the death of the person he had done all of this to save. He said it with the calm of someone who was delivering information. He said it, and Darth Vader stood in the silence that followed, and the silence had a particular quality, the quality of a sound that is too large for any room, a sound that exists in the frequency below what instruments can measure. He said one word. No. He said it, and the Force moved through him without direction or discipline, and every window in the facility shattered and the droids scattered, and the room broke around him, and Palpatine watched it all from a safe distance, with the expression of someone observing a thing they had designed working exactly as it was supposed to work. What Palpatine knew, and what Darth Vader could not yet fully comprehend, was that the anger was the point. Padme's death was not a miscalculation. The grief was not a problem to be solved. All of it, the love, the fear, the loss, the rage at the loss, was fuel. It was the power source for everything Darth Vader would become and everything he would do in the service of an empire that was built on exactly the same foundation as the man himself, on fear, on the desperate and violent management of the possibility of loss, on the application of overwhelming force to a universe that had demonstrated it was not safe. He had been trying since childhood to make the universe safe for the things he loved. He had never been given the tools to do it through anything other than the methods the dark side offered. The Jedi had given him a code instead of a container, a philosophy instead of a relationship, a framework for managing emotions without the actual felt safety that might have made the management possible. Palpatine had given him something that felt like being seen, which was the one thing he had needed more than anything else. And the thing that Palpatine had given him was poison dressed as nourishment. And by the time the poison was identifiable, the damage was done. Darth Vader walked out into the galaxy that Palpatine had built, and he was the instrument of it. He was the darkness that kept the fear alive in 1,000,000,000 beings across 1,000 systems. He was the enforcer of an order built on the wreckage of the one he had helped destroy. He was terrifying, and he was enormously powerful, and he was underneath every piece of black armor and every mechanical breath and every demonstration of force sufficient to reduce admirals to silence, still the boy from Tatooine, still the one who could not let go, still the one who had loved without half measures and been broken by the loving. He was still in there, exactly where Padme had said he would be. She had known. She had said there was still good in him, and she had not said it as a hopeful projection or as a refusal to accept what she had seen on Mustafar. She had said it as an observation, as a statement about what she had understood after years of knowing him in the way that only people who love someone without distance can know them. The good was not gone. It was buried under everything that had been done to it, and everything that had been done in its name. It was buried under the suit and under the wars that Vader fought in service of the Empire, and under the decades of performing a darkness that was genuine but not complete. It was buried under the name that the galaxy feared. It would come back. The galaxy would find out, eventually, that she was right. The boy who had been born on Tatooine, who had loved his mother with everything he had and never stopped loving her, even after she was gone, who had trusted Qui-Gon Jinn with his future and never fully stopped trusting even after trust was used against him, who had married Padme in secret and named his love for her the most important thing in his life and never stopped meaning it, who had been broken not once but across 1,000 small moments of being something the world could not hold without breaking. That boy would return. There would be a son. There would be a moment on a Death Star when the thing that Palpatine had built as an instrument looked at a young man who was about to die for the same reason that Anakin had done everything. Out of love, out of the refusal to accept what he was being told was inevitable. And something that had been waiting underneath the armor for decades would move. He would throw Darth Sidious into a shaft. He would do it the way he had done everything that truly mattered in his life, on instinct, from the part of him that lived below decision-making, from the foundation, from the thing that Tatooine had installed in him that said, there are things you do not let go of, and there are losses you do not accept. His son was about to die. He could not let that happen. He had always been, underneath everything else, the person who could not let that happen. But the story does not end there. The story ends on Tatooine, in a sense, where it began, with the sun setting over sand and a woman who had nothing giving everything she had to a boy who needed it. The story ends in the quiet of the thing that was true before any of the rest of it happened, before the Jedi and the Council and the Code and the war and the fall and the suit. The story ends with the original love, the first love, the unconditional love that said you matter, that you are here for a reason, that no matter what this universe does to you, the core of who you are is something worth protecting. She was right about him. She was right from the very beginning, and she was right at the very end. The tragedy of Anakin Skywalker is not that he fell. People fall. The tragedy is the distance between who he was and what he was given to work with, the gap between the depth of what he felt and the adequacy of the support offered for feeling it, the silence in the space where someone should have been able to say to him, I see you, all of you, not just the power and the potential and the prophecy, all of you, the fear and the love and the grief and the longing and the boy underneath all of it who just needed to know he would not lose everything again. Nobody said that to him. Not clearly enough, not early enough. not in a way that reached the part of him that needed it most. And so he became what he became. And the galaxy moved through the darkness of it for 20 years. And his children grew up on opposite ends of the universe, not knowing who their father was. And Obi-Wan kept watch on a desert planet with a particular expression that people who have failed someone they love tend to carry. And the Empire stretched across the stars like a shadow that had no limit. And underneath the armor, underneath the breathing, underneath everything that Darth Vader had been made into, Anakin Skywalker waited. He did not know he was waiting. He did not know there was still anything left to wait for. He moved through the halls of Star Destroyers and the corridors of Imperial installations and the aftermath of battles fought in the service of something he had not chosen so much as fallen into. And he was enormously powerful and entirely alone in the way that people are alone when they have lost every person who knew them before they became what they became. He waited. And one day, a ship called the Tantive 4 tried to make the jump to hyperspace in the Tatooine system and did not quite make it. And a corridor filled with stormtroopers and a door was cut open from the outside. And Darth Vader stepped through the smoke and looked down the corridor at the chaos of a battle that was already over. And the breathing moved through the vocoder in its measured mechanical rhythm. And somewhere beyond the edge of the system, on a desert planet beneath two suns, a boy who did not yet know anything about any of this was growing up in the house of the man who had married Anakin Skywalker's mother. The tragedy had not finished writing itself yet. It was still in the middle of its long and terrible arc, but the beginning of the end of the tragedy was already planted. The way all endings are planted, in the same ground as the beginning, in the desert, in the love that does not let go, in the child who carries the father in him whether he knows it or not. Anakin Skywalker broke across 20 years of his life. He broke the way things break when the pressure is applied at exactly the wrong places, for exactly the right amount of time, by someone who knows where to apply it. He broke, and the breaking remade him into something the galaxy feared. And the thing that had been in him from the beginning, the love that would not release, the grief that would not quiet, the boy who had built a droid from scrap in the back of a junk shop because he wanted something that would stay, that thing was still there. It had always been there. It was there at the end when it mattered most. Padme was right. She was always right. There was still good in him. There always had been.